Wars cost money. Every bullet fired, every building bombed, every intercepted missile. Each of these actions comes with a hefty price tag. But how exactly do you calculate the financial burden of war, say, on a daily level? To put it bluntly, it ain't easy. But our military experts are here to break it down for you. Today, we are diving into the jaw-dropping daily cost of the ongoing war in Ukraine. So sit down, grab your ledger books, and buckle in. Oh, and spoiler alert, this may shock you. Of course, we lead with the necessary disclaimer: it is impossible to know the exact cost of a war on this scale, or any scale, in terms of blood and treasure. You and I both know that as war itself unfolds under its own fog in real time, the precise number of shells fired, soldiers killed, buildings destroyed, or, for example, the true acreage of agricultural yields lost to hidden mines, unexploded cluster bombs, remnants of rockets, and shellfire riddling the countryside remains obscure. Sometimes historical clarity never comes. Decades after the cataclysmic global conflicts which defined the 20th century, historians, economists, and analysts continue to debate the scale of the destruction, the true human cost, and the financial ramifications of World Wars I and II. For those of us watching a conflict from afar which hasn't even ended yet, the task is not an easy one. The financial effects of this war will reverberate in ways we can't even comprehend for decades to come. Suffice it to say that from public international sources which we have been able to consult, it should come as no surprise that though the cost is astronomical, it is by no means a perfect representation. In war as in peace, nearly everything costs something. To show how we've tried to enumerate the daily cost of the war today, let's start with a thought experiment. Try to imagine an average day in Ukraine. At the time of writing, Ukrainian forces are waist-deep into their summer counter-offensive, attempting to penetrate Russia's defensive fortifications from the southern to the northeastern tip of Ukraine. On any given day, you have small firefights and larger supporting probing maneuvers within distinct pockets across Ukraine's 1,000-kilometer front line with Russia. And big or small battles are expensive. Soldiers paid a daily wage carry hundreds of bullets and dozens of grenades with them into battle, clearing garbage-strewn Russian trenches of their occupiers as dozens, hundreds, even thousands of artillery shells are fired by each side in support. Drones, some of them expensive military makes, but the vast majority inexpensive commercial offerings, linger overhead to provide reconnaissance, direct added firepower, and fire support. The price of the soldiers' wages, the ammunition expenditures, and the drones alone required to wage the ongoing counteroffensive must be staggering, but that barely scratches the surface. Tanks and vehicles factor in too. Both sides employ a vast array of armored vehicles, tanks, artillery, rocket systems, personnel carriers, and civilian vehicles at any given moment, some donated by external countries, some furnished by Russia and Ukraine themselves. Each of these has a paid crew tasked with operating them. When they are damaged or destroyed, each side attempts to salvage what they can. Fixing vehicles requires additional mechanics, tools, and spare parts, which add up. As you zoom out, the expenses multiply. Soldier welfare is a major cost as both sides employ them by the hundreds of thousands. They need money, food, clothing, and equipment to subsist in the field, and medical services if wounded. Getting a wounded soldier to the rear hospital means you must factor in the cost of the ambulance employed, the fuel expended, as well as the cost of the medical equipment, the medical staffs, and the medevac itself. They are taken to hospitals which may run on skeleton staffs, but whose own infrastructure commands its own financial attention. In death, both sides must keep morgues running, pay family stipends and funeral costs, and we're still only beginning. Soon, the civilian sphere comes into the picture, and here the war's destruction has been arguably far more devastating than on the front lines. The World Bank estimates that Ukraine has incurred $400 billion worth of destruction in collateral damage, epitomized by the waves of cruise missiles and random criminal attacks on civilians, which regularly rain down on Kyiv. Reconstructing damaged apartment blocks, water mains, sewage lines, power grids, and if you happen to be in Bakhmut or similarly devastated places, literally entire cities, and you start to see the scales involved. Harder still to contemplate is the relative economic consequences of the war's refugee crisis. An estimated 8 million Ukrainians and hundreds of thousands of Russians have fled their respective homes, some by force, others by choice. Within Ukraine, another 5 million are internally displaced. The towering economic cost of not just providing transport, food, and accommodation for these people, but also the relative shock to the domestic economic system by their absence and long-term effects of the brain drain may cripple both nations' financial outlooks for decades to come. Then you wonder what it might take to rebuild things like the Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine, whose floodwaters devastated towns and villages downstream. Oh, and we still have the robust coalition of Western and other nation-states donating weapons, military equipment, and aid by the hundreds of billions every year. Many of these countries rationalize this as a small price to pay to have Ukraine virtually dismantle Russia's once vaunted arsenal. And yes, Putin is burning through soldiers, planes, helicopters, missiles, tanks, political capital, and other military resources at an alarming rate. But it all begs the question: is it sustainable? Can Putin continue building new fortifications in and around Ukraine as the counteroffensive unfolds? Can he sustain the cost of massive warships sunk, the careless hemorrhaging of Russian conscript forces thrown into the meat grinder willy-nilly, the omnipresent pressure on the Russian economy imposed by Western sanctions? Some analysts have estimated that Russia, increasingly cut off from a huge chunk of the global economy and left with many of its goods unsold, has already lost $1 trillion on the war thus far. One thing is certain: if Putin doesn't give the order to cut his losses, the bleeding will not stop anytime soon. The long-term economic ramifications could be seismically bad for Russia. That said, let's get down to brass tacks. Let's begin by factoring in some averages for Russia alone. Over a 9-month span, it was estimated that Russia expended anywhere between 10,000 and 50,000 artillery shells a day. We know the average cost of a Soviet-caliber artillery shell is about $1,000, so that means that Russian artillery costs hover at upwards of $50 million a day. Multiply that out over a 16-month span and you easily have tens of billions of dollars spent by Russia on artillery shells alone. Estimates put Russia's missile expenditures over that same 9-month span at $12 billion, with each one costing a cool $3 million. What's more, Russia has lost almost 300 combat aircraft, with those coming in around $18 million apiece, and 261 helicopters, each costing on average $10.4 million. Total aviation losses over 9 months, somewhere in the region of $8 billion. We all know the dismal combat record of Russia's tank crews, and how a cheap $100 Chinese drone using a 3D printed release mechanism can drop a single anti-tank munition and knock out a vehicle worth tens of millions of dollars. Well, we should go through Russian vehicle losses just to get a taste of what this war has cost Putin and his people. To date, Russia has lost 2,114 tanks. If a T-64 costs $1.1 million, a T-72 costs $1.2 million, and a T-80 costs about $3 million, a T-90 will set you back $4.5 million. The confirmed cost of losing these models destroyed, abandoned, or captured alone would be as follows: 56 T-4s, $61.6 million, 1,112 T-72s, $1.33 billion, 537 T-80s, $1.61 billion, 68 T-90s, $306 million. That is a cool $3.3 billion on tanks alone. Then you have to add in the cost Russia has incurred trying to repair and maintain its aging tank fleet in the field, as well as the costs of every single truck, armored vehicle, and personnel carrier confirmed destroyed in Ukraine, and experts say that Russia has lost about $20 billion worth of vehicles. It seems relatively cheap to keep an average Russian soldier on the battlefield in Ukraine. On average, after all, it costs the Kremlin just around $200 per month for each soldier. But we also know that last September 2022, Russia mobilized 300,000 new conscripts, on top of several 100,000 forces already in the field. It was reported in January of 2023 that Putin authorized another mobilization of some 500,000 soldiers. Since it is unclear when these forces will make their way onto the battlefield, let's simplify things a bit. How much would it be to keep just 300,000 conscripts on the battlefield over a 9-month span? 300,000 soldiers paid $200 a day for 9 months amounts to $16.44 billion. Stretch that out to another 7 months, the current length of the conflict, and the increasing number of mobilized soldiers, and we can safely estimate that the bill will come in somewhere in the region of $30 billion. Die in battle and the costs continue to mount. Reports indicate that Russia pays the families of deceased soldiers a death compensation of 7.4 million rubles, or $110,000 per soldier. There's no clear indication of just how many Russian soldiers have actually died in Ukraine, but we know the number is incredibly steep. On the conservative side, there are some indications that around 40,000 Russians have died thus far. If this is the case, then the Russian government has shelled out around $4.4 billion to the bereaved loved ones of its fallen dead. What of the Russian casualties, at least those that make it to the aid stations and aren't brutally left behind by their comrades? What does it cost for their treatment? In war, it is generally a safe estimate that for every death, there will be around 3 times that number wounded or missing. That's over 100,000 men, which would be another $5 to $10 billion to treat. It's tough to say exactly, but for those who have sat down and honestly tried to crunch the numbers, experts estimate that Russia's venture in Ukraine is costing $10 billion per month, for a total cost of $160 billion over the past 16 months. Mobilization has wreaked havoc on Russia's domestic economy. Some say that the country is in the midst of a massive brain drain, having lost 1 million of its best and brightest workers over the last year alone, many of whom fled the country outright. To replace these educated and skilled laborers, you have to find replacements and train them, a very costly thing to do. In most cases, Russia can't afford to even do that, and has had to vastly scale back, even shut down many of its firms. That tends to happen when you mobilize hundreds of thousands of men all of a sudden, without a graduated plan to compensate for their absence in the domestic sphere. Russian industrial production has contracted 5% over the last month. One former advisor at Russia's central bank recently told NPR that as Western sanctions continue to freeze Russia's economy, it has increasingly attempted to take over foreign assets within its borders to compensate for its financial and industrial losses. It is a sign that despite what Russia is telling the world, its long-term economic health is not as resilient as it may seem. If you're a Russian billionaire or oligarch, the war has not been as profitable as others may have been in the past. It is estimated that the Russian upper crust has lost around $93 billion worth of assets in 2022 alone. Normal Russians are becoming more and more frugal, saving their money for when times get even leaner. What this means is that Russian commercial markets are on the verge of long-term stagnation. Goods imports are down 20% from 2021. Technology imports have decreased by 30%. Car production is down by 67%. Russian arms exports, once a crown jewel in the Russian economy, have slumped. Even if Russian GDP hovers around the estimated $2 trillion, a figure the IMF endorses, it is spending a lot on fighting. How much military spending, you ask? Well, in 2020, the so-labeled second most powerful nation in the world spent $61 billion on its military, a not insignificant sum when you think about how much it had to maintain. Well, that figure jumped sixfold in 2022, with Russia spending $346 billion to try and re-inject life into its stillborn invasion. Russia has been paying for this war entirely from its own pockets, unlike Ukraine, and it will be feeling that down the road. But figures revealing the true cost for Russia are often at variance with one another. Take, for example, a recent Special Operations Forces report, which alleged that the war was not costing Russia $10 billion a month, as we tallied earlier, but an even steeper $900 million per day. Breaking it down even more, we'd see Russia shouldering military expenditures of around $27 billion a month, or $432 billion for the 16 months that have passed. These might be ballpark figures, but it might be closer to reality than we think. The country's economy has been fractured, its military potential is severely crippled. How long can Russia sustain these losses? Over a 2-day span during Ukraine's counteroffensive last month, Russia was said to have lost 48 artillery platforms, 2 fighter jets, and 2 helicopters. One of the fighters was a Sukhoi Su-34, which costs anywhere from $40 to $50 million. The other, an Su-35, which costs from $40 to $65 million. Hundreds of millions of dollars lost in the time it would take for you to travel from one side of the world to the other. Putin has to hope the Russian bear has deeper pockets for the hard fight ahead. Ukraine is facing an equally grim financial future, if not far more so. Yes, it has been supported at every step by incredibly generous donations from countries around the globe, but with its cities, fields, and forests acting as the war's primary theater, material destruction has rained down on Ukraine on par with some of the largest wars in history. Last year, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky estimated that not counting reconstruction costs, it took around $5 billion per month to keep the war going. If Ukraine hopes to continue the war, Western donations will have to keep coming. That is, as long as Western governments can convince their populations it is in their interest to do so. Let's assess some of the numbers from January 2022 to January 2023. So far, more than 30 nations have funneled military equipment into the country. The US has donated the most military aid over that span, giving just under $50 billion, including the game-changing HIMARS rocket launcher systems, self-propelled artillery, M2 Bradleys, and soon, M1 Abrams tanks, and the latest anti-tank weapons. This dwarfs the second-place donor, the United Kingdom, who has given $5.13 billion. After them, you have Poland, who has given $2.5 billion, Germany $2.47 billion, Canada $1.35 billion, and the Netherlands at $0.9 billion, and Italy, France, Norway, and Denmark all just under $1 billion. Relative to a country's GDP, however, many smaller nations, especially those in the Baltic and in Eastern Europe, have been punching above their weight. While the US would rank 8th in terms of aid donated relative to GDP, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, and Lithuania have given more than their fair share. Among other things, Ukrainian troops are road testing real-time online information and networking systems, drone jamming guns, and maritime remote-controlled kamikaze boats, expensive Western systems that take real know-how and expertise to operate within a combined arms setting. They are improving their intelligence and surveillance gathering efforts. They are becoming experts at psychological warfare, joint operations, and sustainment logistics. It's been a whirlwind crash course, to say the least. But they have not worked alone. As far back as 2014, Ukrainian officers were receiving Western training, especially from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and other European nations. These programs, arguably more than the weapons and munitions themselves, are conferring Ukraine a distinct battlefield advantage. We aren't sure how much these training programs cost, but while they certainly aren't cheap when you factor in the salaries of the instructors, translators, and other observers, the munitions and vehicles utilized, the transport and accommodation for Ukrainian forces abroad, and the training programs being taught, they have undoubtedly proven their worth. Another dimension of aid doled out to Ukraine has not come from the governments, but from private corporations, charities, and multinational organizations. Companies from Elon Musk's SpaceX, which provided Ukraine with Starlink satellite internet use, to Amazon, which provided over $50 million in tech for logistics and cybersecurity, to all the sleeping bags, cold weather gear, cooking equipment, field generators, first aid kits, clothing, and fuel units they might need in the field. Private citizens have shown how normal people, when working together, can achieve incredible things. Pooling together their resources, the citizens of European and other nations have donated hundreds of millions of dollars to the Ukrainian cause, with the Czech Republic, Taiwan, and South Korea alone donating $171 million, $33 million, and $3 million respectively. Some countries like neutral Austria provided 500,000 vaccine doses rather than money or military gear. Other countries like Azerbaijan helped deliver humanitarian aid to refugees. Taken together, all these costs add up to astronomical levels. From ammunition expenditure to destroyed vehicles and infrastructure, soldier and civilian hospitalization, humanitarian donations, and urban reconstruction, you are able to come to a reasonable estimate of what the war has cost thus far. The Kiel Institute for the World Economy in Germany, for example, said in February 2023 that aid from the world's nations added up to around $150 billion. In 10 months, Ukrainian officials tallied up 149,300 destroyed and damaged residential buildings, 131,400 private homes, 17,500 apartment buildings, and 280 dormitories, adding up to another $54 billion, or $5.4 billion per month on average. If you add in the extra months, you get somewhere in the ballpark of around $80 billion, or $180 million each and every day, just to repair damaged housing. The infrastructure toll is also extensive. In early December 2022, Ukraine's Ministry of Development of Communities, Territories and Infrastructure said that in 10 months, Russia had destroyed 150 bridges and overpasses, amounting to $35 billion. Extend that for the remainder of the war, and you get more than $53.4 billion, or $118 million on bridges and overpasses alone per day. That doesn't touch on the 3,000 educational institutions struck by Russia, including 1,400 secondary schools, 865 preschools, and 505 institutions of higher education, costing $8.6 billion over 10 months, or an additional $28.67 million a day. The Kyiv School of Economics also said the 907 damaged cultural facilities, the 168 sports facilities, the 157 tourism facilities, and the 95 religious facilities would cost another $3.3 billion in 10 months, or $7 million a day. They chalked up more costs too: $6.6 billion for agriculture, $2.9 billion for transport, $2.4 billion for trade, $2.3 billion for utilities, $2.2 billion for culture and sports tourism, $1.7 billion for healthcare, $6.6 billion for energy, $700 million for electronics, $300 million for social and financial setbacks, and $14 billion for ecological damages, and you get $137.8 billion in damages over a 10-month span. Averaged out, that is over $206.7 billion in 15 months, or $458.33 million a day for Ukraine's domestic reconstruction alone. When you add Ukraine's $207.6 billion in cost to Russia's total of $405 billion, you get $612 billion combined, or $1.36 billion a day. But wait, there's more. Ukraine must also pay its 1 million soldiers, who receive more than double the monthly wages of their Russian counterparts, at 20,000 hryvnias or $550 a month. Those in the heat of battle can make up to $2,700 a month with a frontline combatant bonus. Ukraine spent $31 billion on its military in 2022. It spends 15 million hryvnias to compensate a fallen soldier's family for his or her loss, over $400,000. So if 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers died, that would be an additional $20 billion in compensation. Ukraine's economic hit has been ruinous. Nearly half of its companies shut their doors in 2022. Its GDP was down 30% in 2022, losing an estimated $70 billion in revenue from the war alone. Ukraine will have to pay back tens of billions of dollars of loaned capital. There have been inflationary price hikes. Ukrainians are worried about not having food, being able to heat their houses or light their rooms at night. This is all relatively easy to account for. But when you try to add up the war's silent toll, from the tangible costs of burying more than the estimated 9,083 Ukrainian civilians killed in the crossfire and settling their estates to the intangible cost of war-related distress stemming from the unnatural exposure to abuse, violence, and the unexpected loss of friends and family, and you are left with a mental health crisis whose effects will linger, possibly for generations. How can you reasonably put a price tag on this? If the Ukrainian government is true in saying 60% of its soldiers have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, the knock-on effects will be akin to past wars, only worse. Alcohol abuse, suicide, depression, and anxiety tend to accompany PTSD diagnoses, and without adequate programs to treat them, Ukraine and Russia will both suffer not only from a massive, long-term economic hit as individuals wrestle with the aftermath of this conflict, but a jarring emotional and mental human one as well. Reconstructing Ukraine may be a $1 trillion endeavor, but most of what the war has taken can never be replaced. But what do you think about the West's financial support in its defense against Putin's aggression? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.